My goodness, is it allergy season? It's one of the worst years we've had in a long time. Okay, so the purpose of this video is to review some aspects of my workflow that kind of where it's evolved to lately. And coffee, gotta love it. And just kind of recap the processes and why I'm doing what I'm doing the way I'm doing it. Number one, I wanted as much as possible to eliminate the time bottleneck in production, which is ink and paint. Usually pencil tests, you know, you're sketching, you're dealing with movement and timing. It's kind of fluid and it's fun and it's pretty fast to do. And it's unencumbered, you just doodle. Ink and paint, you know, this is where precision is required. And obviously some people could argue that the animation step can be oftentimes quite time consuming as well. But I find usually if you plan ahead and look at what your next steps downstream are going to be, it's really not too bad. But in any event, what I wanted to look at is it possible to actually eliminate completely the entire step of ink and paint? Is there a way to do this so that much of the ink and paint process and what's problematic about it is eliminated completely, or you eliminate the possibility of the things that can go wrong? The two big things that go wrong are, number one, the quality of the imagery in regard to how the lines and the color work together just look a little shoddy and not really good enough. That's problem number one. The problem number two in practice a lot of times is leaking, where you have something that you've inked and you go to fill the area and you realize the area is not closed and it leaks. Okay, so this is not a look over the shoulder and see the artist at work kind of video. This is the work's already done. I'm going to recap it for you, and this is just to show the workflow and how the things I've learned have informed my process. Okay, so this is a completely typical storyboard type of shot where we have the character of Golik. So number one, the first thing I've been finding myself doing is the following, and I've never done it this way before. I've been using the freehand path tool and in the mode of foreground color for an automatic fill. Okay, so in this scenario, typically my second step would be underneath the storyboard image. I'm going to go ahead and do the following. Okay, then what I'm going to do, so what I've done is I've essentially just created this silhouette. Okay, now let's keep this in mind because this might be important later when it comes time to add our outlines. But after doing this, sometimes I'll turn this off of curve mode and put it into raw so it's a little rougher edge, and then I can go in and just kind of tighten things up. And I can hit the E key in erase mode and chisel out as needed. Okay, and okay, so we have our silhouette. Well, the interesting thing about that in Krita is you can use this as a mask, so the layer above it, if I put it in alpha lock mode, or inherit alpha mode I should say, now still using the freehand path tool, I can go in and just kind of go like this. Doesn't matter if I get a little leak here because his hand obviously is flesh tone as well. Okay, and then oftentimes what I'll do is put this layer in behind mode so that now I can actually start painting like this, and I can't accidentally go outside the lines. Okay, this is not, by the way, the definitive version of this shot, but you can see So what I'm kind of embracing is the idea that this will sort of become the style of the show to a degree. Okay, and I'll just to uh, make it fair, we'll go ahead and get the rest of that put in there. This should be that, so I can just lasso it, and for the most part, that's that. Okay, so now if I turn off my outlines, this is what I have. Okay, this kind of works for me because what I find is from a detail standpoint, what I tend to do is just add another layer, and obviously we would probably want to keep the sketch in here, maybe really light. Okay, but then this is really the first time where I actually grab the brush, and now I can get that sort of scan pencil art look that I've mentioned in other videos that I just happen to like the looks of. You can just go ahead and smack in the details that I want, judiciously dealing with these in-between areas as needed. Okay, so this is, I'm roughing this in pretty fast, but normally the cool thing is that this process actually does go like really fast. Okay, so how long have we got here? So we're less than 5 minutes, and we already have a character that's mostly inked and painted. All right. So then I might go in here, go into the color layer, and say, well, we need eye color, so I'll jump back to the freehand path tool and just boom, boom. Oops, we don't want to be in behind mode anymore. Go to normal mode. Okay, and then typically what I'll do is I'll add one more layer up above, alpha lock that, we'll call this the shadow layer, and then I just go like this. Boom, 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 boom. As you can see, very fast, very fluid, blah, blah, blah. And then we just turn this down and dial it in. Okay, so now you say, well, what about the outlines? The answer is, let's turn this sketch off. So then when I turn the sketch off, it kind of informs where I might need to add a little more detail. Obviously, I inadvertently left off his goatee. You'll see the actual art that I used, because this is actually slightly off character as well. But again, typically this is what would happen. There's going to be boom, boom, boom. Okay. So then what I'll do is I'll make a duplicate of this silhouette. Okay. So I'll dupe it, and then I'll take this, because remember this is alpha locked to this. So if I turn this off, the color will disappear. So therefore, what I want to do is duplicate it and then go ahead and bake down the color. So now the color is locked, but I have the silhouette copy under it, and then I do two things. Number one, I do a filter that's going to be a blur, and if this was animated, obviously we would want to do it as a filter mask so that it applies to all animation keys. Okay, and then I'm going to go Control M, which is going to be a curves, and just crank that down to nada. Okay, so now you can see, because of that operation, a slightly blurred version of the silhouette, that now I have all my outlines. And if the line's not quite bold enough, you can just dupe it a couple times like that, and then bake down repeatedly. And then you can dial that in. Dial in the opacity of those outlines. Okay, so I think anyone would agree that in 10 minutes to have gone from a simple storyboard image of this to actual relatively finished art is pretty snappy. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is grab all these layers and delete them, and go ahead and turn back on. That's the color key from another shot, by the way. Okay, go ahead and turn on the the layers that I use. So in this case, I did the shadow layer, but I also added a second layer that was an overall color cast. So there's our actual finished art. Okay. Could it be improved? Yeah, perhaps you could go into the ink layer and maybe say, well, let's give his clothes some details here. This sort of thing. Okay. All right, and so then that's the first step. So now let's go to the second step. The second step would be kind of explains why I'm favoring Blender over OpenTunes for this kind of stuff, because what I'm finding is with a static pose, this one's problematic to a degree because the guy's got his hand in front of his face. I guess I want to go this way. Okay, it would be better if his hand was not in front of his face. So in many cases, I'll just for purposes of illustration, I'll show this. Let's see. I'm just baking it down so that I can then take the S key, and I'm only doing a rough version of this again for demonstration purposes. But in many cases, this is what I would do. I would just grab this, move it elsewhere, anywhere, as long as it's not touching, like so. Okay. And in fact, in this case, it'd probably be better to just go Control X, Control V, and just put it in a separate layer. Excuse me, sorry for sniffling. Okay, so now I hit Escape, and what I'm going to do is go back to this freehand path tool, and then in this underlying layer, I'm going to just go ahead and just do a fill operation here, and then this is actually kind of useful because it's sort of, by getting that hand out of there, it sort of informs the underlying drawing and shows me a couple things about it that actually needed to be improved. So let me. But again, this right now is just mainly for demonstration purposes, so I'm not being as careful as I otherwise might. But I'm going to just go ahead and zoom in here and see what needs to be maybe fixed up a bit. By the way, whenever I change colors, you can see when I click down, you see that right there. That's a bug. That is absolutely a bug in Krita that in practice doesn't matter most of the time. What happens is if I'm using the freehand path tool, yeah, freehand path tool. Okay, if I sample a color, invariably when I click the first time, I just immediately hit undo. So it's a bit of an inconvenience, but not a deal breaker. Okay, so you'll see in a minute why this would actually normally be a good idea to go ahead and separate this the way I just did. All right. Because, well, I can actually show it this way. Now if I brought this into Blender, I could map this entire picture to a plane and then just separate this mesh. So now all of a sudden I've got this, and I can do whatever I want with it animation wise. So it's pretty easy to see why having this separated would be definitely quite useful. I'm actually just playing around here with the idea that maybe his hand could be slightly smaller. And it doesn't really matter where I put this as long as it's not touching the rest of the area, so that it's easy to separate them. Okay, so now I'm going to actually go ahead and in liquify mode make one more change to this, like so. So once it's baked down, it's pretty easy to do this kind of stuff. All right? Okay, now, okay, so I bring it into Blender, and this is what we see. Now, I'm not going to recap how to do this other than to just say add mesh images as planes. When you add an image as a plane, I tend to put it in emit mode, and if this was an animated image sequence, that would be perfectly fine. You would just select all the images in the sequence, and you would have something that animates in the 3D viewport. Okay, so in terms of what is really here, this is what's really here. And if I put on world background, you can see. Okay, So just for completeness, I will say this. Um, when you uh, are going to be doing deformation in Blender, if you were using bones, this is kind of important, and you'll see it in this other one. Well, actually, let me jump over here. Let me jump back and forth between these two instances of Blender just to show the difference here. The basic rule is this. If you're going to do anything that involves a little bit of subtle movement, changes of expression, blah, 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 then shape keys are wonderful for that. If you have um, if you're going to have to do rotation, in other words, you've got an arm that needs to bend, then you probably want to favor using bones. Okay, so as an example, that's the only reason this example is here. What's interesting about this is the original picture was actually simply swiped from my storyboard. Okay, so let me just go up here and show the picture that was used. It's this one right here. Okay, so there's the picture that I used. And I just ignored the sheep for testing purposes. But what I wanted to figure out was a couple things about the way the bones interact with meshes. And my question was, okay, if in Blender I bring this in, and as you can see here, what I did was I simply separated the two pieces apart. Okay, you could go even further with this, like say in this respect. Let me show. I will go like this. I'm going to select this, and then I just hit the P key. Okay, so now you actually have, now his hand is separated. Okay, so my question that I had was, what if I create an armature, which is just as fast as going add, actually I want to be in object mode. Hello, object mode. Okay, I'll be like a Mac user and click, 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 because I love clicking. Okay, how do you create an armature? You add a bone, and then you jump into edit mode, and you just start hitting the E key to extrude. That's it. It's just that simple. Okay. All right. So that's what I did here. And the question I had is, well, can I take that skeleton and apply it to multiple meshes and have them all behave as if it was one single mesh? And it turns out, yes. In fact, you can. So I was able to grab each of these and then hit Shift and grab the skeleton, and then you go Control P to parent the meshes to the bones with automatic weights. Now, I think, to be clear, in this scenario, what you would actually want to do is break apart the mesh after you've parented it to the bones. And the reason is that when you do the parenting and you do automatic weights, you want Blender to figure out the weighting of it based on the entire everything that it's going to have to deform. So it makes more sense to parent the skeleton to your mesh and then break your mesh into pieces. Now, what I was going to say in the beginning is, you'll notice obviously that this mesh was originally a rectangle, and then I went in and just took pieces of it like this, Control drag just to select, and then I hit the X key to get rid of those vertices. Okay, you can see what I did. And generally that's what you want to do. So you see the same thing here. If I jump into edit mode, you'll see that after I subdivided the mesh, I went ahead and cut out all the vertices that were essentially useless. Okay, that's really good practice. The biggest reason is, if you're using bones, what you'll find is that if this was a complete rectangle mesh all subdivided, then when you apply the bones to it, Blender's going to think all those empty vertices that aren't actually part of your picture are important, and so the weighting of the bones is going to take into account all those different vertices that actually would be better deleted. So the result is that because of the way the automatic weighting goes, then later when you move the bones, what you'll find is this bone here is actually influencing his head up here, and you get all this interaction that you really don't want. Okay. So the order of operations would be to I'll actually demonstrate it. I'm going to open another instance of Blender and actually demonstrate that whole order of operations really fast, so you can see how you can use this immediately. You're going to go Shift A, Images as Planes, all right. And in my case, I'm going to browse to my scenes folder. I'm going to put Blender in icon mode so I can actually see the little pictures. And now I'm going to grab, let's just grab a picture. I'm going to favor emit mode as opposed to shadeless. Bring that in. Okay, the purpose for emit mode is so that I can go into the material for the character and I can turn the emit up and down and I can actually deal with lighting. Okay, so here's what I was talking about. If you tab, you can see that you can see what you've got here to work with. All right. So what I'm typically going to do is then immediately subdivide this surface using simple subdivision. And if I was in this mode, you can see that I can break this up as detailed as I wish. If you actually wanted it to be more detailed, you would just add the subdivision surface modifier multiple times. I've never had a situation where I've needed more resolution than 6 subdivisions. Typically 4 or 5 is fine. And then I apply it. So now, by applying it, that subdivision becomes baked into the mesh, and when I hit tab to go into edit mode, you can see that actually now we have this highly subdivided mesh. Okay, so then the next step I would go through is to actually just go like this. I'm going to say, well, let's just take everything that doesn't matter and get rid of it. Okay, so now I didn't do a great job here. Normally I would have done a better job, but I can actually compensate to a degree by just editing the mesh. And that's an important point, is what I found is oftentimes if you have a drawing where you're a little bit off character and some modifications are required, you can just add a shape key to adjust for that. So for example, let me show what I mean by that. If I jump over here and I add shape keys, I'm going to add this shape key becomes the basis for everything. And then let's just say, actually let's take that one off. Let's just say that Golik was a little off character. Okay, so we say, let's say for example we thought his head should be a little bit wider, and I didn't catch that earlier in the process. Well, I can go in here and just widen his head. Not saying this is a great idea, I'm saying that this is an example of what you can do. Okay, and now when I add another shape key, let's say this is where he's going from a scowl to a more compassionate look. Perhaps even with a bit of a smirk. Okay, now I can dial this in anytime I want. So for demonstration purposes, that's what I was trying to explain before. Okay, we'll come back to shape keys in a moment. I want to try to wrap this up in less than a half an hour. My point back here was that if you're going to be doing rotation and joints and arms and legs, it's better to use bones than shape keys. Okay, and what I found was if you create an armature, you can parent it to multiple objects that are subdivided vertices, and as long as the parenting takes place before you separate out the mesh, Blender does a very good job with it. So now if I hit Control Tab and go into pose mode, you'll see how effective this is. Look at that. I mean, Blender nailed it. Okay, this is about as perfect as you could possibly expect for this kind of a okay, I want to hit my comma so it's actually right. So now obviously it's not perfect, and here you could actually make a slight modification. Let me see if I go on the Z. Yeah, so I can actually stretch out his staff. So, and by the way, just so you see over here on your options, when you're in pose mode, you can turn on auto IK, and that's why you can just grab bones and drag them around and do whatever you're going to do. So again, if you're doing any joint bending, it's highly recommended to use bones instead of shape keys. However, in this case, now this again shows how I went from storyboard to essentially finished art in well, would it take less than 10 minutes? Okay. Then I came into Blender, and I swear, folks, this what I'm about to show was also done completely in about 10 minutes, which is this. Is that crazy? How'd you do it? Well, I created a shape key for a smile. I created a shape key to actually, now this is the craziest thing. Instead of doing a camera move, I said, well, what if I just go in here and just go into edit mode, select all, and then just scale up the whole mesh. Just change the size of the whole mesh. So I sort of bake a camera move into the character itself. Shape key number 3. I just wanted to put a little bit of a shift of weight, which I'm not going to argue looks that great, but again, this shot was kind of for testing purposes. And I want you to know that, by the way, like this last move would probably make almost more sense with bones than with shape keys. You can, if you would hope, if you take a mesh and you apply bones to it, and so now the bones are doing like with the arms and legs, but then you also have shape keys to sort of massage the shape of the mesh. You would hope that what would happen is essentially the bones would do their job, and then the shape keys would sort of amend that in sort of an intuitive way. And where would that make a lot of sense? Well, what if I take an arm and I bend it, but when I bend it, I also want the muscle to flex, right? You do the muscle shape with your flex keys, but you'd actually do the arm bend with your bones. So the question is, does that work intuitively in the way that you would hope? And the answer is yes. It very much does. You can do bone animation with Blender and then go in and make modifications with shape keys, and everything works as advertised. And if you really want to get ugly with it, you can actually use, I'm not going to explain it here, but you can use drivers where the angle of a bone causes the shape key to be invoked, so that whenever, let's say, you bend this bone, the muscle flexes, right? So in this case, once I put in just a few keys, and by the way, to animate your shape keys, you do the shape key, so you jump into edit mode, and as you can see, by jumping between them, I get to see what those poses are. But when I jump out of edit mode, they disappear. See? Okay. So all you do is, as you go through your animation and try to dial it in, you just grab the shape key that you want to work with, and you just hit the I key. You just put your mouse over the value and hit I, and it inserts a keyframe there. And so then the final step was, let's go here and put in the world background so we can see what we're doing. I actually just put in 2 lights. Okay, this again is why I have my character in emit mode. Okay, his emit level is actually turned down all the way. If it was turned up, you can see he'd be ridiculously bright. The thing is, if he was shadeless, the lights would have no effect. Okay. But by having him in emit mode, if emit is set at level of 1, it's exactly the same effect as being shadeless. But in this case, what I did was turn it all the way down and let the lights do all the work. So in this case, what I did was I have a light back here that's essentially backlighting him. You see that? And then this light, I simply did the same thing over here where I keyframed it. At the beginning, it's a white light, and then I animated it by just putting my mouse over it, changing the color, and then again hitting the I key. Just hold your mouse over it and hit the I key, and it changes to blue over time. So now the net result is this little change in expression, and this is obviously the end of a scene where, um, da 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 da, right? Okay, that's it. It's been 30 minutes. That explains a lot of really useful things. Um, it's good stuff. What I've been finding is the process of going from a rough storyboard to finished art has been proving to be extremely, um, well, let's just say it's efficient to the point that I can live with. And the nice thing about this workflow, by the way, to add a final button to all this, is that it's procedural. In other words, I could get everything dialed in here, and then I realize, oh man, I actually want a little bit of clearer definition, say, of his beard. Well, I can just go back in here, fix the beard here, save the ping image back out, and reload it in Blender and re-render. That's it. So it's a very procedural workflow that's very fault tolerant. So anyway, that's it for now. Hopefully you found this helpful. Anything I did here you could do in Blender 2.8, and I will say this. If I were going to put in the learning curve to literally start from scratch with Blender 2.8, and I wanted to give it a month, I probably would do so, because the way I'm working now actually is probably best, I shouldn't say best, well suited to the Blender 2.8 grease pencil workflow. At this point for me, because I have much more flexibility with painting and filters in Krita, essentially drawing and painting in Krita and sometimes animating, but then animating in Blender 2.79 for me gives me most of the benefits, if not more of the benefits, that I would have with the Blender 2.8 grease pencil. However, everything I've done here today, essentially, if you wanted a workflow similar to this and you wanted to just use one program, honestly, Blender 2.8 would probably be where you'd want to go. I haven't done it because, I mean, obviously I know the rudiments. I've posted a video here that's gotten thousands of views about Blender 2.8 grease pencil for newbies. Okay, I know how to use it. However, 2.83, I almost feel like it's a completely start from scratch situation, in terms of learning curve, because so many things have changed in the interface. So many hotkeys don't do what they did for 20 years, things like that, that to me it's like, okay, if I really needed it, I would do it, but this workflow here I'm finding is extremely useful. By the way, and one other thing about that is using these shape keys combined with regular pixel-based art that you can go in and change procedurally would actually be more difficult with the Blender grease pencil. And the reason is that your shapes tend to be baked into your keyframes. So in other words, in the Blender grease pencil, just as an example, and then I really will be done. This is actually the great weakness of the Blender grease pencil for me, is you don't have enough control over the granularity of your keyframing. Maybe that's not true in 2.8. Okay, but here the basic problem is that if this drawing had been done in the Blender grease pencil, the shape of his mouth would be baked into the drawing. So what happens is, if I go forward here and now let's say he has a new expression where I've deformed it and I've made him smile. Okay, but then I realize there's a problem here, which there is, with his goatee. Well, if I fix the goatee here, it's not fixed back here. Is that overcomable? Yes. You could do the fix in a different layer. You could create a patch. I do the same sort of thing all the time in Krita. But there's a fair amount of fiddling and parenting and organizing that would have to take place every single time you've made a mistake that happened down, upstream, that's going to affect what you're doing downstream. This workflow is very fault tolerant. Just by changing this picture, everything downstream automatically just works. So that's just a sort of a comment about the difference between the Blender grease pencil and this mode of working. And by the way, for me, there's kind of 3 steps to this process. there's the pencil test, which I kind of put storyboarding in with the pencil test. This is a very fluid process. You're just sketching. You're just feeling the characters, feeling the animation, okay? That's step one. Step two is ink and paint and creating your finished art assets. The workflow I'm embracing now is proving to be beneficial in the sense that by and large, my overall final imagery is getting crisper and better. This is kind of, you can see I'm sort of embracing it as a bit of a style too. So it looks a little more flash-y, flash in the sense of Adobe Flash. But the efficiencies gained are so significant that it's worth saying, okay, this is sort of the style I'm embracing here. But the overall imagery is pretty crisp and you know looks quite good. So the net result is that my work has gone down and my quality has gone up. So it's a double win. And the most problematic part of the process is ink and paint. This procedure that I've demonstrated here today seems to make that process as painless as possible. Okay, and so step 3 is animation. Okay, so I really think of my whole process as being broken into those 3 steps. There's the storyboard and the pencil test. There's ink and paint and sort of construction. That's a very mechanical process. And then there's animation. It's interesting because step 1 is very creative. Step 2 is very, I don't know what the word would be, managerial. To me, I'm just a machine. You know, it's not the most creative process. It can be, and it is at times, but for the most part, it's a mechanical process that you just have to do. And then step 3 is to go ahead and, you know, put the pieces back together and or animate it, blah, 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 blah. A lot of times what I'm doing is I'm getting to this step right here. In practice, it would often be the case that I would do something like this. I would put in a keyframe here. I'd say, well, why am I going to even go to Blender? Okay, why don't we just do this? Go 1 on 3s, 2 on 3s, 3. Okay, and then here let's go. Boom. We'll put in a keyframe. And right here, let's go, whoops, let's go liquefy, really. Right. See. And you know, if I can do it and solve it in Krita, then I do. And in fact, there's many shots that are essentially just a close-up, let's say, where there's lip sync. So, you know, lip sync using this methodology is stupidly fast. And I'll show you why, and then I promise this will really be the last thing I do today. I just create a new layer and make it black. And then I take the free transform, or the freehand path tool, and 1. Okay, and then I insert a key. And then I tend to go forward maybe 5. Insert a new key. Insert a new key. Insert a new key. Whoops. Insert a key. And then I just turn it down so that a little bit of the underlying flesh tone color comes through. So again, obviously this is a very quick and dirty demonstration, where if you really wanted to do it correctly, what you'd do is you'd come here, you'd grab this color, and by gum, you would obviously erase the mouth. Okay, so let's take this. Okay, so I'm going to go there. I'm trying to get Krita to this is a complete dyslexia moment, literally dyslexia moment, where I'm having to think in reverse and my brain doesn't do it very well. Okay, got it. And then here we would just go I'm in the mouth layer. Okay. So again, lip sync takes often 1 or 2 minutes. This actually took longer than usual. And in this case, obviously you couldn't have the lighting effect very well, and you couldn't do the push in if it wasn't for Blender. So even if you did all this primary animation, you'd probably still want to bring it in here. So anyway, that's it. 41 minutes, not too bad. I'm 10 minutes over, but hopefully you learned something. Questions and comments down below. Be sure to subscribe. Ding, ding, ding. As everyone always constantly tells you. And as you guys know, there will be more later.